She told me I shouldn't touch her. But the moment my hands did, something between us shifted, and nothing would ever feel the same. The first day at the new company felt like stepping into someone else's world. The office was small but bright, sunlight spilling across polished wooden floors, and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. I had imagined meeting the boss would be intimidating, but the one who caught my attention the moment I walked in was his daughter. She stood behind the reception desk, effortlessly poised, flipping through a stack of papers with the kind of grace that comes from years of experience. She looked up when I approached, and our eyes met, hers calm, confident, yet there was a flicker of curiosity I couldn't place. She was in her early 40s, but she carried herself with a vitality and elegance that made the age difference between us immediately apparent, though not in a way that felt awkward, just quietly magnetic. I extended a hand to introduce myself, and when our palms brushed, there was a subtle spark, fleeting yet undeniable. She flinched almost imperceptibly, pulling back, and I felt a small, teasing challenge in that retreat. It was the kind of reaction that made me want to understand her, to learn what lay beneath the confident exterior. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that both invites conversation and sets boundaries at the same time. The first few interactions were mostly professional. She handed me a folder, and our fingers brushed again, this time longer, almost accidental, and I could feel the faint warmth of her skin lingering. She said nothing, just a quiet clearing of her throat, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of surprise and something softer, something like curiosity edged with hesitation. It was the start of a silent dance neither of us could yet name. As the day wore on, I noticed small details about her that made her presence linger in my mind long after I left the office. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slight arch of her brow when she considered a problem, the gentle cadence of her voice when speaking to colleagues. Everything about her exuded experience, composure, and a subtle vulnerability I wanted to protect. Later, when we were both reviewing documents at a small meeting table, my hand accidentally brushed against hers while pointing to a line of text. She froze for a fraction of a second, her gaze dropping, and then met mine with a mix of warning and something unspoken, a silent acknowledgement that she felt the same tension I did. I wanted to reach out again, to test the limits of that delicate boundary, but I hesitated, recognizing the line we weren't supposed to cross. That first day set the stage for everything to come. The contrast between her calm assurance and the quiet spark she seemed to ignite in me made it impossible not to notice. There was a magnetic pull in her presence, subtle yet persistent, a tension that whispered of possibilities we both weren't ready to name. And in that moment, as I walked out of the office that evening, I realized that this wasn't just another job. Meeting her had shifted something in me, and I had no idea how, or when, it would change her too. The days following my first encounter with her were quietly electric. Each time I entered the office, there was a subtle shift in the air, like a current running just beneath the surface. She moved through the space with her usual composure, but now I found myself noticing the little things, the way she lingered slightly longer over a cup of coffee, or how her fingers brushed against papers with a rhythm that seemed almost intentional. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew the magnetic tension between us was real. Our interactions were mostly mundane, yet charged in a way neither of us could ignore. Passing files across the desk, walking side by side to the printer, or even sharing a moment of quiet while both of us stared at the same spreadsheet. Each ordinary task felt heavy with possibility. Once, as we reached for the same pen at the same time, our fingers touched. She jerked back ever so slightly, but then glanced at me with that same quiet curiosity that had intrigued me from the start. My heart had skipped a beat, but I smiled gently, letting her pull back. There was an elegance to her gestures that contrasted sharply with my own nervous energy. She exuded the confidence of someone who had navigated life's complexities and came out steadier for it. Watching her, I could feel my own awkwardness soften. Her presence had this strange, grounding effect, and I found myself adjusting my tone, my posture, my movements to match hers, almost without realizing it. One afternoon, She leaned over the table to inspect a report I had prepared, her shoulder brushing mine. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a warmth through my chest I hadn't expected. Her scent, something faintly floral, yet subtle, lingered in my senses. I caught myself staring at her hand as it rested lightly on the paper, noticing the fine lines and the soft curve of her fingers. For a fleeting moment, it felt like time had slowed, and the office around us melted into a quiet world where only we existed. She began to share small personal details in passing: a weekend hike she enjoyed, a favorite coffee shop tucked away in a quiet street, the way she unwound after long workdays. Nothing heavy, nothing intimate in the conventional sense, but enough to create a bridge between us. And I, in turn, began to notice how much I wanted to know her, not just her routines, but her thoughts, her feelings, the quiet places she rarely showed anyone. It was in these little, unremarkable moments that the tension between us grew, not from overt gestures, but from subtle glances, slight hesitations, and the gentle dance of touch and retreat. She was still careful, still wary, but there were moments where her walls faltered ever so slightly, and in those moments, I glimpsed a softness, a vulnerability she only let me see. By the end of the week, I realized that our connection wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was in the tiny, shared moments: the brush of a hand, the shared laugh over an office mishap, the quiet understanding in a glance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, we were building a rhythm of our own, one where curiosity and restraint coexisted, and where every small connection carried the weight of unspoken attraction. By the middle of the second week, the tension between us had grown into something almost tangible, though neither of us dared name it. Every time I entered the office, I felt it in the small, imperceptible shifts of her posture, in the way her gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary. She carried herself with her usual composure, but in quieter moments, there was a flicker of something more, a hesitation, a vulnerability, a pull that she herself seemed to wrestle with. It happened one afternoon while we were organizing paperwork in the conference room. The space was empty except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers. I handed her a document, and our fingers brushed, briefly, almost accidentally. She froze, her eyes dropping to our hands for a heartbeat before meeting mine again. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in her expression, a momentary surrender to the tension that had been building between us. Her words came quietly, almost a whisper: "You shouldn't touch me." There was no anger in her tone, only a mix of warning and something unspoken, an acknowledgement that she felt the same pull, even as she resisted it. The words weren't a rejection. They were a confession in disguise, and I felt a strange thrill at the vulnerability hidden beneath her restraint. I smiled softly, careful not to overstep, and replied in the gentlest of tones, teasing yet tender: "Then stop melting under my hands." The words lingered in the air, teasing the edge of propriety while hinting at the deeper tension neither of us could deny. She didn't respond immediately, only let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh, her lips pressing together as if to contain her reaction. And yet, in that pause, the electric charge between us thickened. It wasn't just the accidental touches or the subtle physical closeness that made these moments feel charged. It was the unspoken dialogue that passed between us in silence. A glance held too long, a soft exhale, the way her hand lingered near mine on the edge of a table. These small gestures spoke volumes, revealing a vulnerability she rarely let anyone see, and a desire she seemed just as reluctant to acknowledge. The age difference between us became more apparent in moments like this, not in a way that separated us, but in the contrast of experience and youth. She carried decades of self-assuredness, grace, and careful restraint. I carried curiosity, sincerity, and a raw honesty that sometimes startled her. It made our interactions delicate and fraught with unspoken rules, but it also made them irresistibly compelling. By the end of that day, I realized that our connection wasn't merely a spark of attraction, It was a quiet, persistent pull, one that neither of us could fully ignore. We had touched the edge of something forbidden, something that required patience and care. And in that hesitance, in that careful dance of proximity and restraint, the slow burn of what was to come began in earnest. A few days after that tense exchange, the air between us seemed charged with both anticipation and a quiet familiarity. The office had grown smaller somehow, every glance, every shared space weighted with unspoken meaning. It was late afternoon when she suggested we finish reviewing a project together in the small lounge, a place with soft chairs, a window that caught the fading sun, and the faint aroma of coffee still lingering from the morning. We sat across from each other, but naturally, our bodies angled closer, drawn into the same space by the rhythm of collaboration. As I handed her a page of notes, our fingers brushed, lingering longer than necessary. She didn't pull away this time. Instead, her hand hovered for a heartbeat, and in that tiny pause, I felt the tension shift, not as electricity, but as a quiet acknowledgement of trust. The conversation shifted from work to more personal matters. She spoke of a hike she loved near the outskirts of the city, describing the way the sunlight fell on the trees in the early morning and the quiet of being alone with the wind. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, and for the first time I noticed a vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. There was a wistfulness there, a sense of longing for simplicity and stillness that she rarely let anyone see. I listened, leaning slightly forward, careful to give her space, but also drawn in by the intimacy of the moment. My hand brushed against hers again, just lightly resting on the edge of her notebook. She didn't flinch, only let her fingers touch mine briefly, as if acknowledging the connection without words. It was in these small gestures, the lightest brush of skin, the quiet focus of her gaze, that our unspoken bond deepened. She admitted, almost casually, that balancing her personal life with the responsibilities of the family business was often exhausting. There was a subtle tremor in her voice, a quiet weariness that she hid behind her usual poise. I reached out instinctively, gently resting a hand over hers, offering reassurance without intruding. The warmth of her skin beneath my palm was grounding, and I felt a pulse of emotion in that fleeting contact, a mix of admiration, protectiveness, and longing. There was a moment of silence after that, filled only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of the office. I noticed her hair fall across her shoulder, and I brushed it back with the softest touch, careful, considerate. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a second, the weight of our unspoken feelings hung between us, delicate, fragile, and profoundly intimate. By the time we left the lounge, there was a subtle shift in our dynamic. We had crossed a threshold, not in words or declarations, but in the quiet recognition of each other's humanity and vulnerability. The tension between us had softened into something warmer, deeper, a connection built on trust, subtle touches, and the willingness to show fragments of ourselves that no one else saw. In that slow, unremarkable afternoon, I realized that intimacy didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It could be a glance, a brush of fingers, the shared weight of vulnerability. And in these small moments, the slow burn of what was to come began to unfold in earnest. It was a Friday evening when the tension between us finally became almost impossible to ignore. The company had organized a small gathering at a nearby gallery, an art exhibit that promised quiet corners and subtle lighting, perfect for observing without being too conspicuous. I had tried all week to maintain a professional distance, but as soon as I saw her stepping into the softly lit room, I felt the pull all over again. She wore a dress that was understated yet elegant, the kind of clothing that seemed effortless but revealed a grace only earned through years of life experience. The way she moved through the gallery, the soft click of her heels, the gentle sway of her hair, made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't anticipated. She noticed me watching, and for a moment, our eyes met across the room. There was a fleeting acknowledgement, a subtle curve of her lips, and a hint of something unspoken that made the air between us heavier. As we walked together from one exhibit to another, Our hands occasionally brushed while adjusting our paths through the crowd. Each accidental touch sent a jolt of warmth through me, a subtle electricity that was both thrilling and terrifying. She flinched slightly the first few times, then began to let the touches linger just a fraction longer, as if testing the boundaries she had carefully maintained at the office. The intimacy was silent, a language of proximity, gestures, and shared glances that spoke more than words ever could. In a quieter corner, near a series of impressionist paintings, our conversation dipped into personal territory once again. She spoke about the colors, the textures, the way light and shadow could evoke feelings she sometimes couldn't put into words. I listened intently, captivated not just by her observations, but by the rhythm of her speech, the way her hand lightly rested on the railing beside the artwork, brushing mine accidentally in the process. There was a long pause, a moment suspended in the warm glow of the gallery lights. She looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race, eyes searching, uncertain, yet undeniably drawn. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing against hers, tentative but deliberate. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest there, palm barely grazing mine, and the simple closeness sent a shiver of anticipation through both of us. Even in the midst of the crowd, in a public space where any misstep could have consequences, the world seemed to narrow down to the space between us. Every glance, every light touch, every hesitant step closer carried weight, and the slow burn attraction that had been simmering for weeks finally demanded attention. It wasn't a kiss or a confession, nothing overt, but the tension was electric, undeniable, and utterly consuming. By the end of the evening, as we walked back to our cars under the dim streetlights, there was a shared, quiet understanding. We had crossed a subtle threshold, teasing the limits of propriety and restraint, and yet we were both drawn deeper into the connection we couldn't yet name. The slow burn romance had reached a peak, and now it was only a matter of when, not if, the next step would come. It was a quiet evening, the office empty except for the soft hum of the overhead lights and the faint rustle of papers on my desk. I had asked her to stay a little longer to finalize a report, though neither of us could pretend that our lingering in the room was purely about work. The air felt charged, familiar yet uncertain, as if both of us were waiting for the other to break the invisible tension. She leaned against the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert, tracking my every movement. There was a warmth in the way she held herself, a confidence honed over years, but I could also see the subtle hints of vulnerability, the quiet hesitation in the curve of her shoulders, the way her fingers toyed with the hem of her sleeve. The age difference between us was palpable, yet it no longer felt like a barrier. It was part of the rhythm of our connection, a contrast that made each interaction more poignant. "Do you ever wonder if this is wrong?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just about propriety or social perception. There was a vulnerability there, an admission that she felt the same pull I did, yet struggled to navigate it. I stepped closer, careful not to startle her, and let my hand brush against hers, fingers grazing lightly in a gesture that was both tender and grounding. "I don't think it's wrong," I said gently. I've never felt anything like this before, with anyone, and I don't want to rush or push or scare you. I just want to understand us." My voice was steady, though my heart was racing. The moment hung between us, fragile and intense, as if time itself had slowed to let us truly see each other. She sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible release of tension, and let her hand rest near mine. "I've felt it too," she admitted, her gaze locking with mine. "I've been trying to resist it, but every time we're together, every small touch, every glance, it pulls me in." Her words were careful, measured, yet full of honesty. There was no need for grand declarations. The truth in her voice carried more weight than any dramatic confession could. I reached out, gently taking her hand in mine, feeling the warmth and softness of her skin. "Then let's take it one step at a time," I said, my thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "We don't have to define it all right now. We just let it be what it is, as long as we're honest with each other. For a moment, she simply breathed, leaning slightly into the gesture, letting the connection settle naturally. It wasn't a kiss, it wasn't a leap. It was something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement that what we had was real, meaningful, and worth exploring. The slow burn attraction that had been building for weeks found a delicate release, not in dramatic gestures, but in shared vulnerability and trust. By the time we left the office that night, there was a newfound understanding between us. Our hands brushed as we walked toward the elevator, a fleeting contact that held promise and warmth. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had transformed into something tender, patient, and profoundly intimate. And in that quiet resolution, I realized that we had taken the first true step toward something lasting, something built not on impulsive desire, but on trust, respect, and the slow unfolding of hearts learning to open to each other. The following days felt different. The office was the same, sunlight streaming across polished floors, coffee aroma in the air, and the usual hum of conversations in the background. But for us, the space carried a quiet intimacy. The invisible tension that had simmered for weeks had transformed into a gentle rhythm, a mutual understanding that didn't need words to exist. Every glance, every brush of hands, carried a warmth that was unmistakable, yet never forced. We found ourselves lingering near each other in moments that would have been mundane before, reviewing documents side by side, waiting for the elevator, or walking down the quiet hallways after hours. Each time our hands touched, it was deliberate yet tender, a fleeting brush that sent a ripple of comfort and anticipation through us both. She laughed softly at something I said, the kind of laugh that made my chest tighten, not with tension, but with the simple, pure joy of being near her. One evening, after a particularly long day, she invited me to join her for a walk through the small park adjacent to the office. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, the air carrying the cool scent of early autumn leaves. We walked side by side, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly, and I could feel the steady rhythm of her presence beside me. I reached out almost instinctively, letting my fingers touch hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand found mine fully, our fingers intertwining naturally, like they had been meant to fit together all along. We talked quietly, sharing small details about our lives beyond the office, favorite books, childhood memories, and the little routines that brought us comfort. There was laughter, yes, but also moments of silence, comfortable silences that felt like they spoke volumes. She leaned in slightly when I mentioned something that amused me, and I felt the warmth of her proximity settle deep into my chest. It was in these subtle gestures that the depth of our connection was fully revealed, trust, admiration, and a growing affection that neither of us needed to spell out. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we stopped at a bench under a large oak tree. She turned to face me, her expression soft, and I saw the quiet vulnerability she had only ever revealed to me. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering for just a moment. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, letting the closeness settle naturally between us. A smile curved her lips, gentle and knowing, and I realized that everything, the hesitation, the tension, the careful dances of our hands and glances, had led to this simple, perfect moment. We didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The slow-burn romance that had grown over weeks had blossomed in quiet, meaningful ways. In the brushing of hands, the shared laughter, the lingering glances, and the patient understanding of each other's hearts. Walking back toward the office, our hands remained intertwined, a silent promise that this connection, built on respect, trust, and tenderness, would endure. By the time we reached the building, there was a sense of completeness, a warm satisfaction that comes from hearts finally finding their rhythm together. The age difference was no longer a question or a tension. It was simply a part of the story, a contrast that made our bond richer and more profound. And as we parted that evening, I felt a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of something real, enduring, and beautifully slow-burning.